but let me give a little brief intro. He's a man of many talents, and his naval career was quite distinguished. He had duty on the ground in Vietnam, as well as airborne and P-3 subchasers. He was on the personal staff, I don't know many people have done this, of the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, the Chief of Naval Operations, and the Secretary of Defense in strategic planning. And that was before he was a commander of Moffett Naval Air Station, which is in the middle of Silicon Valley, which must have been kind of interesting. After his naval career, he became a naval researcher and historian, and now has 8 books to his credit. And he's been a lecturer both here and abroad on many subjects, but primarily naval history. So as the advertisement goes, our latest book is Aground, which is a fascinating story of basically the history of the Navy from the Civil War to World War I, while the Navy was trying to figure out what kind of ship it should have, what color they should be painted, and whether they should have boilers or sails. So let me turn it over to Andy, and thank you for joining us, Andy.
Happy to do it, Kathy, and thank you for your time, attention, and introduction. The photograph you see in front of you is a picture of USS Tennessee. Actually, at the time this picture was taken, she was USS Memphis. She'd been renamed just days before the wreck so that would free the names of the states for a new class of battleships that the Navy was building and buying. So USS Tennessee, August 29th, 1916, ends up hard aground on the rocks outside of Santo Domingo. This is a photograph soon after that wreck. And you can see that she is on shore, and we'll talk about how she found herself there and what happened. What happened, among other things, is the ship was completely destroyed. What we call strike damage. It was not possible to rebuild it. As it turns out, it wasn't possible really to salvage her either because of her position on the rocks. Ended up with 43 of her crew killed in the wreck, several hundred injured, and of course the ship completely destroyed. We move on to the next graphic, if it'll let me. And it's not. Hang on a second, I'm trying to make it do that. Okay, let me consult with my counselor to find out why this is happening. Page down. See what I mean by brains of the outfit? Mm-hmm. The book we're talking about was published in February by the University of Alabama Press. They have a sideline in maritime history. I'm not sure why, but the publication of that book is what prompted the preparation of a talk like this, so I can tell people about the book and about the story. It is more than the story of the ship. It is more generally the story of the United States Navy as it's groping for its mission and composition at the end of the Civil War. The Civil War of the U.S. Navy fundamentally tried to maintain a blockade of southern ports to prevent the resupply of the South or trade in cotton by the South with the rest of the world. So that was a very specialized small mission and suggested nothing about what the Navy of the future should be like. So during the era, the decades that followed the Civil War, the Navy is trying to figure out what its mission ought to be. The officers in the Naval Service, of course, are looking for as expansive and, for that matter, as expensive a mission as possible. But the rest of the navies of the world are trying to figure that out too. Ships are extraordinarily expensive, and the high cost meant very few units. Anybody could afford relatively few units. They had to figure out what it was they were going to do with those ships. and how many they could afford and how they would use them. And the US Navy is caught up in the same process. What you're seeing here is the Judge magazine cover of August 12th, 1882. And the burly gunner on a ship, it says Her Majesty's Navy, is waving his cap at the anemic, anorexic Uncle Sam going by in a skiff. It's marked US Navy. And the caption is, you're small, but you're good. You're little, but you're good. The background of this cover from Judge magazine is the fact that the Brits had put ashore troops and fired on the shore in Alexandria, Egypt, in July of that year, 1882, because they were trying to preserve their control over the Egyptian government and specifically over the guy who was in charge. And somehow the Navy's European squadron, several ships of the US Navy's European squadron, had gotten sucked into that process. Lancaster, Quinebaug, Nipsic, and Galena were the ships, and they had fired on the shore. They put men ashore. They had protected the American embassy there, although it's not clear that it needed protection. But their participation was welcomed by the Royal Navy. And what's interesting about this cover of Judge is the enormous size of the Royal Navy's gunner and the very large size of the ship, and the anemic little scow that's the US Navy. And the caption is, you're little, but you're good. In the 1880s, the US Navy was very little. And whether or not it was good is a judgment that I think other people would argue with. What begins to happen as that period draws to an end is the Navy starts to better understand the character of its mission at sea and the kinds of ships it's going to need to pursue that mission. And it will construct what is called the White Squadron. Here are representative photographs of the ships of the White Squadron: Yorktown, Boston, Concord, Atlanta, Newark. This bottom right-hand illustration shows them steaming in 1891. And what you see there is something that we were talking about before this talk began. Notice that these are fully rigged ships. They've got masts and sails. And while they're steam-powered, coal-fired boilers producing the steam to drive them, there isn't a whole lot of confidence exhibited by the very large sailing rigs that these ships also have. This is an evolutionary moment in Navy history as the century begins to draw to a close, as the US Navy is trying to think through what the ships of the future will look like, and necessarily what Congress will be willing to pay for to let that happen. The illustration here is by a young man named Louis Sontag. He died in 1898. It's thought that he got malaria when he went to Cuba during the war there. But this is an illustration that shows the entire US Navy handsomely done in a magazine. At the time, it was the 5th largest in the world, behind Great Britain, always, France, Russia, and Italy. And this picture shows you from Harper's Weekly, June 19th, 1897, just before the beginning of the Spanish-American War, an illustration of how the Navy had redefined itself from the Civil War and the Age of Sail in the space of 30, 40 years into a much more modern steam-powered force. And look here, and you will not see the sailing rigs that characterize the vessels of that transition squadron we just spoke about. These ships are driven by coal-fired steam boilers, and if that doesn't work, they're not going anywhere. They're not going to raise sail and proceed under sail. The near future is going to demonstrate the value of those ships and the value of the technology represented in them. Painting by Malero here that you see is the wreck of USS Maine lying on the floor of the harbor in Havana. She blew up there February 15th, 1898. The book is a description of that tragic loss by her captain, who published that book. And in 1898, the United States will go to war with Spain, a war provoked by this incident. It is still not completely clear what caused Maine to sink. You can hear two different arguments. One is a mine or some other infernal device of the Spaniards. The other one, and it's equally possible, I think, is an explosion in her coal storage spaces from gases that were emitted from wet coal. And those kinds of explosions had happened to other ships from that source. And it's at least possible. Hyman Rickover thought it was certain when he did analysis of this. It's at least possible that Maine blew up not because of some infernal device of the Spaniards, but because her coal storage bunker exploded and sank the ship. In any case, this will be the moment, the decisive moment, when steam power and big guns prove the direction that navies of the world are moving in the future. This rather impolite illustration from Judge Magazine shows the Crown Prince of Spain playing with boats. He was 13 at the time when this war went on, which is why it's captioned Unlucky 13. He's playing with boats on Cuba while the United States is preparing to reduce his dignity with a shot in the butt, intervention in reprisal for the sinking of the Maine. You're familiar with the rough outline of the Spanish-American War, the great battle in the Pacific, the Battle of Manila Bay, the 1st of May, 1898. This is an illustration from one of the period magazines showing that battle. The American consul in Hong Kong had transmitted information to the Navy about the strength of the Spanish fleet in Manila, their location, and Admiral Dewey put that together and sailed into the bay and took on the Spanish fleet, destroyed the fleet, and captured the base structure as well, one of the great triumphs of the Spanish-American War, but there were others to come. What happened in the Spanish-American War was an answer to the question that Puck magazine had raised in several of its covers. Puck is another one of the news magazines of the period. The cover on the left, April 27th, 1898, shows a ship in the building ways, and the caption under the photograph was "An unknown quantity in naval warfare." In April 27th, and this is now before the Spanish-American War, in April 27th, it's not clear what these expensive battleships the Navy has managed to buy, has managed to get Congress to pay for. It's not clear exactly what role those ships will play in wars to come. By the time the second cover is published, it's absolutely clear. The United States Navy has swept the Spanish Navy from the seas, and battleships have now become, metal ships, iron ships, have now become the instrument of naval persuasion. This launches an era of enormous self-confidence in the United States. A handsome cover from Puck magazine shows the United States here in the form of a wasp-waisted young woman rising to becoming a world power as she dons her hat, which is a heavily armored US Navy ship. She's pinning it into place with a naval officer's sword, and the steam coming out of the stacks of that ship. The ship is named World Power, US Navy, and the guns are marked Army, Navy, is expansion, and the excitement of power and growth and the ability to enforce your will is reflected in this Puck magazine cover that shows this prideful young woman donning a hat that gives her world power status. That status allegedly is going to be applied to the preservation of peace. Another Puck magazine illustration, this is a really handsome one, shows the entire American fleet steaming behind a battleship where peace is riding on top of the superstructure. Notice it's Roosevelt's face on the front of that ship. The fleet extends from horizon to horizon as far back as you can see, and even the doves of peace flying above her are armed with bayonets, rifles with bayonets on them. This is March 29th, 1905. After the Spanish-American War, the United States is now beginning to claim a hegemony over the hemisphere, a hegemony substantiated and supported by a very modern and enormously expensive Navy that now ranks among the top several in the world. Navies appear in the politics of many places during this era, significantly during the Russo-Japanese War that is fought between February 1904 and September 1905. The Japanese destroy successively 2 Russian fleets. The illustration here we'll talk about in a minute is Petropavlovsk being destroyed by a Japanese attack on the cover of a French news journal, Le Petit Journal. A powerful illustration. What happens is the Japanese first destroy the ships in port, the Russian ships in port at Port Arthur, and their what amounts to their Far Eastern fleet. The Tsar will send around his Baltic fleet, his Baltic Sea fleet, around from the Baltic, below Africa, into the Pacific, all the way to Japanese waters, where that fleet will be humiliated and handily destroyed by the Japanese. The cover is from 1904. This is now still a year before the end of the Russo-Japanese War, which ends with Teddy Roosevelt, incidentally, negotiating the peace treaty between the Russians and the Japanese. That treaty does a number of things. One, it gives Teddy the Peace Prize, Nobel Prize. 2, it signals the decline of Russia and the Russian Empire, a decline that will be dramatically underscored during World War I. And 3, it signals the rise of the Japanese and the Japanese Navy specifically, a change, a geopolitical change that we'll see a whole lot more of as the century progresses. But that's a rather imaginative and colorful cover that marks some profound changes in naval history at the time. Here in the United States, the Navy has been growing dramatically and significantly since the Civil War and since Americans, civilians, and figures in government have come to the understanding, hang on a second, have come to the understanding that navies afford international status and have some utility, notwithstanding their extraordinary expense. The illustration you see on the left, the map on the left is the Philadelphia waterfront, a part of the Philadelphia waterfront, and circled there is Cramps Shipyard. This shipyard has been building vessels for sea, for not just simply the Navy, but for commercial use as well. Since 1830, that shipyard will almost make centennial. 1927, the photograph on the right duplicates the map details on the left, an enormous yard, 7 building ways, huge engineering capability. It is from this yard that USS Tennessee will emerge. They will be the building yard for USS Tennessee. And here she is as modeled on the cover of Scientific American of the period. Armored cruiser Tennessee, the competitive contract was let for a little over $4 million. She was commissioned July 17th, 1906, delivered on time, and sparing the building yard the late penalties that would have accrued for every day the ship was delivered late. The article in Scientific American about the ship is an extensive one, but more generally it talks about the place of the US Navy among the navies of the world. Not long after Tennessee is commissioned and is put to sea, Jamestown, the city and port of Jamestown, holds what it calls the tercentennial, the 300th anniversary of settlement. And as part of that, incidentally, they're aping the Chicago Fair that was the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of the New World, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Jamestown and Virginia are very deliberately aping this, hoping to become as sensational a success as that exposition in Chicago did. It will, in fact, be a financial catastrophe, costing the port a great deal of money and failing to attract the tourism and the income that they'd hoped, largely because of grotesque mismanagement. But it does result in a large concentration of naval ships off the port. And this poster here, handsome poster here, shows you that concentration, among which we will find USS Tennessee and others like her. A handsome illustration. The Navy participated enthusiastically and left even more enthusiastically because of poor management and financial mismanagement, as I've suggested to you, and the enormous cost of the exercise to the Navy. And I mentioned also that it aped the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, which was a great success. Much more in line with the Navy's wishes and a much greater publicity success and general demonstration of the powers of the U.S. Navy is the cruise of the battleship fleet around the world. This is a map, a hand-drawn map by an electrician on one of the ships, a hand-drawn map of the cruise around the world, December 1907, February 1909, of the Great White Fleet, launched by Teddy Roosevelt to demonstrate Americans' prowess at sea, its capabilities to steam around the world in formation, stopping in various ports, including ports in Japan, where they were welcomed, despite the sense of antagonism between the two countries because of mishandled immigration issues and a natural competition that begins to arise in the Western Pacific. This is the cruise of the battleship fleet around the world, hand-drawn, all inspired by Teddy Roosevelt. That cruise and other events in the period rightly suggest that there is an international competition now for bragging rights and also for developing the kind of capabilities at sea to be able to impose your politics and your aspirations upon the larger world on the strength of your fleet. Puck magazine shows this competition in an interesting, I think, cover. This is Uncle Sam, the German William II, French president, the British king, and the Japanese emperor playing poker. And the stakes of this poker game are the ships that are littered on the floor around them. And the caption is, "I see your cruisers and I'll raise you a dreadnought, raise you a battleship." This is Puck magazine demonstrating the extent to which international ship construction and the size of navies has become a measure of manhood, almost, of the ability to influence politics. That's just about the time that World War I erupts in Europe. These are recruiting posters from that war. We can talk about it. It is a catastrophe on many dimensions, a catastrophe that will solve nothing, which explains in part why there is a World War II, barely a scant generation later, but these are the recruiting posters of that period. And here, quite literally, is cry havoc and unleash the dogs of war. This is a piece from the Imperial War Museum in Britain. It's a cartoon, and it shows you Europe as the dogs of war are being unleashed. There is the Tsar driving a steamroller into the heart of Central Europe. Meanwhile, the French and the Brits are barking at the French and the Germans are barking at each other. Down in the corner, the Sultan, the Turks, are squeezing shut access to the Black Sea. And in the top left, the Brits are launching their fleet against the ports of the continent. That war will focus attention on the navies of the world, as you would expect it would. The US is not a combatant in the early period of the war. Instead, what happens is the many tourists, estimated 300,000 American tourists in Europe at the outbreak of the war, suddenly find themselves unable to pay their bills because nobody accepts their letters of credit. Their banks are refusing to give them funds. And what will happen is USS Tennessee will be ordered to Europe carrying bankers' gold to bail out Americans, the hundreds of thousands trapped on the continent during the early years of the war. Here is Captain Benton Decker on the top left, the commanding officer of USS Tennessee, and she sails for Europe with her lower hold filled with barrels of gold coin. And these are some of those barrels of gold coin. And the effort is to rescue American citizens trapped over there. Tennessee's logbook is kept in the archives. This is that logbook for this period. This is the entry by Captain Decker explaining that he has received telegrams from the Secretary of the Navy, been instructed to proceed to Europe to carry this money and to relieve the distress of Americans overseas. In that area, you didn't need to travel necessarily with a passport. There wasn't American Express, no access to foreign currency easily. The bank letters of credit, if those letters of credit aren't accepted, people got themselves in real trouble. And that's, of course, what the ship's mission was. She sailed over to England to deliver that money to ease the distress of the many Americans there, students and families and others, over to Rotterdam for a somewhat similar mission, and then received late in what was supposed to be a period of her returning back to the United States, received late orders to proceed to Brindisi and on into the Mediterranean to assist American citizens in the Mediterranean with the interruption of all surface traffic, commercial service traffic in the Mediterranean as the war begins. These are some of the ports that you will call on. Smyrna we'll talk about in a minute, Beirut and Jaffa and Alexandria. Those last three ports, Tennessee will move back and forth, hauling refugees from the Turkish colonies on shore into Alexandria, Egypt, where they will be taken care of and moved further. These refugees fear that the Turks, now allied with the Germans and Muslims, will abuse Americans, specifically those who were there as missionaries and educators, and it will become this ship's mission to extract them. But in so doing, she will end up taking many thousands of refugees from the coast, the Turkish coast, to Egypt. That will be her mission. At the time, Henry Morgenthau, you see pictures of him here, is the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and it is at his request that these combatant ships have come to the Eastern Mediterranean to assist Americans and to calm the waters, so to speak. Morgenthau is an important political figure because he's been making contributions, political contributions to Wilson, but beyond that, he is an enormous figure, not coincidentally the grandfather of the historian Tuckman, who we'll talk about in just a moment. His problem will be that the ship tends to move without direct political direction, and Tennessee will practically start the American participation in the war early. She arrives, this map shows you Chios and the entrances to the port of Smyrna, and the larger map locates that on the Turkish peninsula. She arrives there, the captain tries to go ashore, the Turks shell his small boat, his executive officer loads their big guns and gets ready to fire on the coast, in which case America would have been thrust into World War I prematurely on the strength of what a young group of naval officers did. But that doesn't happen happily. And what happens instead, as I mentioned to you, is the enormous movement of refugees. This is a photograph of some of those refugees being carried to Egypt from Turkish colonies on the Asia Minor coast. Tennessee gets to come home at the conclusion of that. And there we go. This article from the newspaper reports the return of the armored cruiser that has been in the troubled waters of Turkey for 8 months. That newspaper report is August the 8th, 1915. And the poem that you see there is written by one of the crew celebrating the beginning of their cruise home. It's a long way to New York City, a long way to dear old Broadway, to the sweetest spot I know. Goodbye to Alexandria, farewell Egyptian shores. It's a long way to New York City, but my heart's right there. This kind of awkward rhymes has him drinking creme de menthe in a New York cabaret, which seems unlikely for the sailors of that period. My guess is they were drinking harder stuff in seedier places. But in any case, at the conclusion of her mission in Europe, Tennessee returns. She will go through some maintenance work to clean her hull. She's been encrusted with all kinds of marine life that really slows her down. Haul some Marines, now literally Marines, down to the Caribbean, where we have been bullying the countries of the Caribbean for some time, and specifically Santo Domingo, because we've had, since before the Civil War, eyes on this region, first because of its possibilities as commercial agriculture, and second, as a home for slave agriculture and the possibility of creating additional southern states out of this region. But right now, in this period, we are simply behaving like colonizers and intimidating the good people of Santo Domingo, and we have a fleet offshore. That fleet includes USS Tennessee, who soon will be renamed USS Memphis, and that will reserve the names of the states for new classes of battleship being built. Tennessee is at anchor off of the capital city of Santo Domingo. The chart on the left is important. Please look at it carefully. What you will see there is the port outside the capital city is very deep water, right up until you're very close to shore. What it means is vessels necessarily at Santo Domingo must anchor, if they don't go into the actual port, the city port, must anchor very close to shore for their anchor cables to be able to reach bottom. And because that port is so open to the weather, it is a dangerous port, known to be a dangerous port, and requires special procedures to be able to anchor there. August 29th, 1916, with Tennessee, now called Memphis, and now with a new commanding officer of a few days, and the flagship of the Caribbean Squadron, is anchored very close to shore in Santo Domingo. That afternoon, on a beautiful, clear day, enormous waves rise out of the south and rush towards shore. This is a photograph of one of the vessels, USS Castine, a small gunboat, in those breakers coming ashore the afternoon of August 29th, 1916. I want to re-emphasize a lovely day in every respect seasonal, except for this surprising march of enormous breakers heading for shore. The result is those breakers will push USS Tennessee, now USS Memphis, aground. They will carry her aground irrespective of Captain Beech's, Edward Beech's efforts to fire up the boilers he needs, the 6 boilers he needs to get her underway. He only had enough fire set up in his plant at anchor to be able to light off 2 of the boilers, and he was not able to get to sea. This is a photograph of Captain Beech. He's a very interesting figure. There's a book about it, about his career and his experiences. You'll see it there on the slide. He is the father of another Captain Beech, the guy who was the naval aide to Eisenhower, who wrote tremendous success, Run Silent, Run Deep, and who took a submarine submerged around the world, father and son. They are the 2 after whom Beech Hall on the U.S. Naval Academy is named. Beech Hall is the home of the Naval Institute, a 150-year-old professional association, and these are the 2 Beeches who that's named after. The photograph there is USS Memphis aground as a result of those waves washing ashore. Beech will be court-martialed and he'll be found guilty of neglect and poor performance. He will be sentenced to lose a number of promotion numbers. He will drop to the bottom of the ranks of captain, which effectively will mean that he will never become an admiral. Here's another photograph of the crew of the ship abandoning the ship, and people ashore looking at this marvel, an enormous combatant ship with almost arm's reach. The figure you see in uniform there, Admiral Pond, escapes surprisingly responsibility for what I believe was his flaws in this. Pond has just recently become the commander of this cruiser squadron. He's a hydrographer. He conducted an enormously impressive magnetic survey of the Pacific Ocean. It is he who cited the location of Pearl Harbor, the naval base, but he's not an operator. And he's more interested in other things. As a result, he has prohibited Captain Beech from operating more than 2 fire rooms when he's at anchor. The limitation means with those 2 fire rooms, Beech cannot get the steam up to turn his engines over to get underway. I would argue that Pond is the responsible officer for this catastrophe because the ship was incapable of getting underway under her own power in the amount of time she had available in this very dangerous circumstance. Astonishingly, at the court-martial of Captain Beech, Pond refuses to testify and Beech does not insist on it. And I believe that testimony would have had a material effect on the sentence. But in any case, Pond escapes responsibility and Beech takes the rap, loses some promotion numbers. The ship, meanwhile, will lose 43 of her crew will die, several hundred will be injured, and of course, the ship will be lost. Efforts to salvage it for scrap even are unsuccessful. It is so difficult to move anything offshore and to take her apart and put her in pieces that the wreck of USS Memphis will be on the ground there for many years to come. Other vessels succeed in escaping. USS Castine, the gunboat here, Patrol Gunboat 6, Castine will be in the same anchorage and she will get underway successfully, escape the waves, and survive the weather that affected the destruction of USS Memphis. The explanation that Beech has is it was a volcanic earthquake that hurled these enormous waves ashore, an act of God that it was impossible to prepare for. The truth seems to be more prosaic. There was a hurricane passing south of the anchorage, some distance south, blowing up these enormous breakers that were running ashore. And it is the product of that hurricane, not some mysterious submarine volcano that created the waves that drive that ship ashore. We're now at the edge of World War I. In August 29th, 1916, the United States Navy's first contribution to the war in the Atlantic arrives in Queenstown. It is Destroyer Division 8. Here's a painting of that division arising. At the same time, Admiral William Sims, United States Navy, is sent to the main naval staff as a liaison officer. And it is Sims's reporting back to Washington that will make clear that the British Navy, and Britain for that matter, are in desperate straits, that their trade has been terrifically interrupted, that the country is capable of going not simply hungry, but of starving. And this starts to put pressure on the United States to participate in the war, to send combatant ships to the theater of war, and to rethink what the Navy is going to do as World War I inflames Europe and threatens, not for the last time, as you historians of World War II know, threatens the viability of the British Empire and specifically of England herself. Sims is the staff liaison. He will be sending reports back to Washington, back to the Secretariat, and it is those reports that will result, for instance, in the division, Battleship Division 9, being sent to the Great British Naval Base, Naval Anchorage at Scapa Flow on December 7th, 1917. Here's a painting that shows the arrival of that division and the greeting of the Royal Navy here on the right. Those are Royal Navy sailors waving their caps in welcome for Battleship Division 9 coming to join them. All this is happening while Josephus Daniels is Secretary of the Navy. He's a fascinating choice for the Secretariatship. He's a man who has seen nothing of salt water. He is a journalist. He's the editor of the Raleigh News and Observer, a loud voice, incidentally, in the business of segregation in the South. He is also a teetotaler, and he will impose on the Navy the end of its rum ration and the end of wine messes on naval ships. And that will raise, this is a political cartoon of the period. It's captioned, "No drink in the Navy," says Daniels, and there's all kinds of little cartoons around the margins making fun of Daniels for trying to make the Navy go dry. The combination of his lack of understanding of what amounted to Navy culture of the period and his lack of understanding of the sea in general, and his pacifism will create enormous tensions inside the Department of the Navy. At the conclusion of the war, there will be effectively a revolt of senior officers complaining about the extent to which he has stamped his character and his personality, and his decisions affected the conduct of the war at sea and lengthened it and made it more expensive. That will be a great political hassle that will play a large part in establishing the structure of the United States Navy, of the Navy Secretariat on the one hand, and of the Chief of Naval Operations and OpNav, his staff, on the other. It will have a lot to do with the politics of the post-war period and the structure of the Navy and the Navy's chain of command as it enters World War II. Meanwhile, the wreck of Memphis lies there through two efforts to issue contracts to take the ship apart and to sell it for scrap. She lies there in this photograph in front of the ball field, the national ball field there, and there are ball players playing baseball, while behind them lies what had been USS Tennessee and what is now a wreck and is defying all the attempts to sell it to somebody who can do something about it. The centennial of the First World War, now I'm wrapping this up if you're starting to get impatient with me talking so much. The centennial of the First World War prompted an explosion of writing about the war's history. I'm just going to show you some titles that came out during that period. I can recommend, I think, honestly, all of them to you. Very interesting books. The First World War by Keegan. Keegan's interesting anyway. The Sleepwalkers, how Europe went to war in 1914. A Dead Wake, it's the story of the sinking of the Lusitania by Eric Larson. A careful political look at Woodrow Wilson, who was the president during that period. Massey's book about ships and construction castles of steel. From imperial splendor to internment is a story about what happens to the German Navy, and it'll happen again, interestingly enough, in the next war. Other books, the Deluge talks about British society and how it was affected by the war, and one more round of them. The War That Ended Peace by the wonderful historian Macmillan, Towards the Flame. The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. She incidentally is the granddaughter of the former ambassador, I think I mentioned to you. That's kind of out of date now, but it is still wonderfully well written and worth the time. Russian Origins of the First World War, and the last book on the right there is called Over Here. I urge anyone who's been interested in this to take a look at those books or to think about them. I would also invite your attention to what I have been doing for the last, 20 years, which is writing books also. Heart of Ground is the most recent of them. You see it there on the right. It was published by the University of Alabama Press. They kind of bailed me out. My usual publisher is the Naval Institute. They were the publishers of ADAC, a book about aircraft ditching off of Kamchatka, Sailors in the Holy Land, 1848 Expedition to the Dead Sea by the US Navy, The Last Lincoln Conspirator, which is a book about John Surratt's escape and his capture, brought back for arrest and trial. Congo, a story about a young Navy lieutenant who was sent up the Congo to explore the business opportunities we might have there. Black Rock and Blue Water, a story about a Royal Mail ship that goes down in a hurricane. Embassy to the Eastern Courts is an early effort of the United States made to open trade with Thailand and other places. And Horrible Shipwreck is the true story of the wreck of a British convict transport carrying women and children to the penal colony in Australia, wrecked on the Channel Coast with the loss of everyone on board, all the prisoners on board, and almost all of the crew. So only a few of the crew survived. So these are what I've been doing for the last 20 years. Heart of Ground is the most recent of those. I appreciate your time and attention. I would be happy to answer questions if we have a way to facilitate that and make that happen.
Well, if people could unmute themselves so that they can ask questions to Andy. There's a little mute button at the bottom left of your screen, a little microphone. And if you, let's see, I think I'm the only one who's unmuted at the moment. Need to turn that little red microphone off at the bottom of your screen. Can you help me out here, Mary?
I can't actually. All I can do is send a request that you unmute, but I can't actually remotely unmute anyone.
Okay. Judy.
So it's up to y'all to speak up. Let's see.
No, I just wanted to say thank you, Andy. That was a fascinating talk, and I'm impressed with the wide variety of topics you've covered in your other books.
They've all been fun to do, and thank you for that. This is a really interesting story because it went so badly for a ship that it should have been around for a whole lot longer, and I think the wrong guy got caught for it. And
so was it just sitting in the water adjacent to the land all that time?
After the wreck? Yes.
After the wreck?
Yes. As I say, they issued, first they looked at it to see if they could repair it and get it underway and out of there. They meaning the Navy. It was clearly beyond that. The ship had been broken such that the structure could not be repaired. So it then was issued salvage contracts. The first salvage contractor did nothing for about 10 years, gave up his contract. The Navy reissued another salvage contract. They were just going to basically take it into pieces, melt them down, and do something else with the metal. And that didn't work either. It finally got hauled off and broken apart in tiny pieces and sort of forgotten until an anniversary celebration the embassy conducted a few years ago, when they put up a bunch of photographs on the beach right where that ball field is, showing what had happened. And that was prompted by a congressman from the state. And that's bits and pieces lying in the water still, but she ended up ignominiously, I think would probably be a good word to use for that. Kind of sad.
It was a great talk, Andy. Thank you so much. Do you have any thoughts you want to share with us about where the U.S. Navy is headed at the moment?
This is a subject that there is enormous amount of discussion about in the kind of professional circles that I eavesdrop on. I'm far enough away from it now that I don't participate in that, except I'm often asked questions about, hey, what happened when? Yeah, and somebody comes up with a date. I think the Navy is trying to think through exactly how it deals with the kinds of challenges that China represents. And that has got a lot of people thinking very seriously about what to do about that, and what exactly does that mean in terms of hardware, strategy, politics, domestic kinds of discussions. The Navy had a tremendous amount of support here a while ago for something called the 600 ship Navy, as a consequence of the then secretary agitating very successfully in government and out. Right now, I don't think most American citizens understand what navies are for. They're enormously expensive. And on top of that, young Americans are much less interested in serving than they used to be. And this is not just in the Navy, but across the board. It has been difficult to recruit in an era of volunteer enlistments, and difficult to retain people in this era. And also, everything is complicated by the easy availability of drugs.
Yeah.
So we are at an inflection point in sea power, and it's not completely clear to me how that's going to come out in ways that are helpful to us. And of course, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and others represent new and complicated threats in a time when we would like to be thinking of other things.
Let me go to the thinking of the Maine, Andy. When I worked at the U.S. National Archives, we had a project to look at the records related to the Maine and its sinking, which are in the National Archives regional facility in Fort Worth, for reasons that are complicated. But anyway, that's where they are. And after they got through looking at that, I became at least convinced that it was indeed an explosion within the battleship, that it was not a mine, that it was not other kinds of things.
That's, of course, what Admiral Rickover's conclusion was, and that's why the Spanish in their National Navy Museum in Madrid have an entire hall dedicated to his memory. Tell me more about your conclusion, though. That's interesting.
Well, what you saw is the amount of coal that was being stored, how long it was being stored, who was responsible for looking after it. I mean, there were a whole series of documents that came together that at least pointed in that direction as far as I was concerned.
I think that's entirely plausible. We had by then other ships that had fires in their storage areas, just as a consequence of poor storage practices, wet coal, Sparks and who knows what else. So Rickover's conclusion and your sense are entirely reasonable, entirely feasible. At the time, those kinds of arguments failed to sway public opinion. The conviction was absolutely that the dastardly Spanish had done Maine in, and boy, it was time to get back. And
Well, and that's an easier political conclusion than to say, oops, we made a mistake with our own ship and our own men.
and it's much easier for the Navy to explain the one than the other. So yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the shipbuilding capability of the United States at this point? You had a lot in your book about, the role that cramps played and things like that. And my sense is, might be wrong, is that we don't have near the capability we used to have.
Well, that's clearly true. The question is, do we have the capability we need today?
Right.
And the evidence seems to be that we're not capable of delivering ships on time, on budget, on spec, and haven't been for a while. And that's scary. It's also very expensive if you follow that path. We're not, that's also true, incidentally, of procurement of other weapon systems as well.
Right.
So it's that's a sort of an omnibus critique I would offer for your consideration.
Judy, did you have any questions you wanted to pose to Andy?
I can't think of anything right now. Sorry.
Judy May?
I just commend the author on his book.
Oh, your commendations are gratefully accepted. I relied a whole lot on period periodicals, if you'll permit me. The art in them is fascinating. The messages, the political messages in them is really interesting. And
Was Andy, on that point, what was Puck's special interest in Navy? They seem to have done extraordinary amount of coverage.
I think it was just an area of expertise they developed, and we're selling magazines as a consequence of it. And yeah, it's fun to see that stuff. You get an insight into the politics of the period that is in some senses more authentic than the heavy analytical stuff that you see. The illustrations I showed you are largely out of Heart of Ground. It ended up at the University of Alabama as a surprise to me. I sent it first to the Naval Institute, the publisher who had done everything else I'd done, and I wrote for them in History Magazine and other things. And they turned it down, and that surprised me. And I've often wondered unkindly whether or not the fact that it took on the beaches so directly had something to do with that. Because for an organization now 150 years old that has its offices in a handsome building on the Naval Academy grounds called Beach Hall, it might have been just more than they wanted to step into. And the University of Alabama, of course, had, they don't care. But on to what's next. What's next is a book called, The Road to Here. Growing Up and Growing Old in Interesting Times. It is a combination memoir history of the past 80 years. It's prompted by the discovery not many years ago of the circumstances of me surviving World War II in Poland, which were improbable. And as I began to sort of peel that back, and it seemed more and more improbable. And then it occurred to me that I needed to embed that memoir into the larger story of those 8 decades. So now 85,000 words into what is threatening to become a never-ending saga. That will become the last thing that I research and write. And I'll couple of quick sentences and I'll leave you alone. It was triggered by the discovery that at the age of several months, I was left on the steps of a church in Warsaw because my mother and grandmother couldn't take care of me, and they watched while I was taken inside the church. And rather improbably, 3.5 years later, 1946, my grandmother finds me with the couple who adopted me from that church, persuades them to give me back. And months after that, we sail from Bremerhaven to the port of New York and begin life here. And as I thought about that, I decided I'd write about it. And as I say, 85,000 words, and I'm still not halfway done, and it scares me.
We'll schedule your author talk whenever you're ready, Andy. We are all
Be sure
going
to
to be the
include us.
first to buy your book.
I'm fearful it'll be posthumous.
Sounds
Yeah.
like it'll be fascinating. I look forward to reading it.
But
That's great.
pressing on. I'm struck by the fact that I survived those improbable circumstances and have some things to say about that and other things as well. Hey, thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Mary.